Hi, everybody. Just 1 second while I'm getting this set up. All right. Okay, so I thought it would be really important to share some thoughts with you about using social media as a social journalism student. Because I think that if you're really thoughtful in how you do it, it can make a really big difference to your career and to the impact that you're able to have on your communities. It made a really big difference, I know, in my career. And that's why every orientation, I really feel obligated to share with you some of what I've learned over the past decade plus of teaching and using, and to some extent researching social media. You're going to learn, of course, a lot about this in your social media tools class. Luis, much smarter than me, way better on Twitter, Instagram, etc. But this is a little bit of a different angle on it than I think you will pursue in that class. Social media is definitely, to be very clear, it is not the only thing we do. It's not even the most important thing that we do, even though we currently have the word social in our program's title. It's also important to acknowledge that social media is difficult, it's controversial, it's a challenging space to be in right now, but it still is a part of what we do. And it can be important for a variety of reasons that I'm going to talk a little bit about here today. So we'll have a session in which we can discuss this a little bit more, but I thought that recording this in this way would be a little more efficient so that, you know, you could watch this on your own time. Okay, so the first time that I taught a social media class was in around 2008, 2009, something like that. And this was when the revolutions in the Middle East were happening, y'all. And I have to tell you, it was an exhilarating time. You know, Facebook, Twitter, were all relatively new. It felt transgressive, even to teach this, because all the old white journalism professors, you know, they were just completely dismissive of this. They thought Twitter was all about sharing what you had for lunch. They were convinced that it was a fad. And I felt like such a badass for teaching my students about these tools and how they could be used in journalism. You know, every day we would come to class and, you know, we could really discuss how journalists were using, you know, social media tools to understand what was happening in the Middle East, you know, the way people on the ground who were activists were using this. It was a very exciting time. Well, I mean, obviously, as you all know only too well, times have definitely changed. Oops. So social media now, right, has all kinds of negative aspects to it, as we know. You know, there's the trolls that are out there, especially for women or people of color or any group in society that has less power, maybe more vulnerable to trolls. Trolls have always been around, don't get me wrong. They're not a new phenomenon, but, you know, a lot of people report that they are much worse now than ever. You know, there are people that may make threats or just say cruel things. That's even more so if you're a high-profile person, but sometimes even if you're not. We're all familiar with, you know, white supremacists, Russian bots, people spreading disinformation and discord on purpose. If you read more deeply into the research on that, it's pretty interesting. A lot of the goals is more about just trying to provoke confusion about what to trust. Because once people feel like they don't have any idea who to trust, they will essentially just shut down. And that's more effective in a lot of cases than just censorship. It's just to cause people to doubt everything that they read. We also know, of course, that, you know, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and their CEOs have not taken their role in combating disinformation and, you know, trolling seriously enough, particularly Facebook. You know, we saw the Cambridge Analytica scandal. There have been many others. The recent pandemic video that spread so quickly, even though it was full of falsehoods. You know, political manipulation by candidates, playing on your emotions, as well as other kinds of marketing and advertising. So obviously, as a result of all of this, as you might imagine, people are moving into closed spaces like WhatsApp to have conversations with just their friends and family there. Now, obviously, since the pandemic, we've seen an upswing in the use of social media tools to some extent. But a lot of journalists, you know, a lot of other folks, there's a lot of manifestos flying around out there. I haven't seen quite as many recently, but last year in particular, there were a ton of these, of people talking about how they were quitting Twitter and how their lives were just amazing as a result. Every night now, you can go online and have people reminding you to stop doom scrolling. And, you know, on the one hand, all of that is fine. I get it. Here's Farhad Manjoo in 2009, New York Times columnist. He famously talked about how he quit Twitter and now his life is so much more relaxed. He doesn't have to, you know, read any nasty tweets with anyone that disagrees with him or anyone that's being mean. And, you know, I get it, right? I really do. And absolutely, if social media is making you anxious or depressed, you need to take breaks. Your mental health is the most important thing out there. But the only thing that I want to suggest here that you at least think about a little bit, and this is, again, it's a personal decision that you'll all need to make. But what does it mean for journalists to quit engaging on social media? What are some of the consequences of potentially doing that? And I think one of the most high-profile examples of social media being used for good is, of course, Black Lives Matter and later Me Too movements. Journalists did not cover police violence in Black communities very often before activists took to the streets, but also started using hashtags on social media to get those issues onto the mainstream national news agenda. Those kinds of tools can be really important in activist movements and can help journalists understand that there are issues in communities that they are neglecting. And I'm sure most of us are pretty familiar with how those kinds of hashtags have been used in doing social media. But I would also suggest that you might need to check some of your assumptions about social media because some of them are wrong. One of the biggest ones, I think, is filter bubbles. People are always talking about filter bubbles and echo chambers. And as it turns out, Rasmus here works at Oxford and has done a lot of research on this. And here he recommends some research on it. You know, the evidence for filter bubbles and echo chambers is not nearly as strong as you think. Or finds, as he says here in this tweet, little or no evidence. Social media users, according to Pew and others, are more likely to interact with people who are different than them than people that don't use social media very often. Heavy social media users are exposed to more different points of view than people that rely mostly on traditional media or just talking to family and friends. Now, what's complicated about this is that, of course, user behavior is going to matter. Making sweeping generalizations about this are unhelpful because, you know, people are different. If you exclusively follow other journalists, for example, in one recent study by Nikki Usher found that a lot of, you know, Washington Beltway journalists are following each other and retweeting and talking to each other a lot. Yes, that does have an effect. Although what this research suggests is that even then, there is evidence that some different points of view are more likely to sneak into your feed than they would if you use social media very little. And that makes sense if you really think about it. Of course, human beings are human beings. We tend to follow other people that are similar to us in some way. Ideologically, they have similar demographic characteristics, similar backgrounds, etc. But social media also brings us into contact with some of our weak ties, people who are acquaintances, people who we met briefly and didn't see regularly, so we didn't form a tight attachment with them. Far-flung family members that maybe you only see at the 4th of July picnic, but you don't talk to very regularly. People with different ideas than you, their thoughts begin to, at least to some extent, filter into your feed. Whereas if you don't use social media, you're even more likely to spend a lot of your time talking to people that are very similar than you. And I just kind of vastly oversimplified that to make it brief. But think about some of those assumptions that maybe you've been having. Here's another one that I hear all the time. Kids don't use Facebook anymore. Now, okay, yeah, that is mostly right. Facebook use among younger people has vastly declined, even more so now that we have TikTok. But here's one interesting study. This is a little bit dated now, but it still makes the point that I'm trying to make, that found that, at least as of a couple years ago, one group of teens that were more likely to use Facebook were low-income teens. This was similar to what happened in the early years of Facebook, when people were migrating there from MySpace. Low-income teens were also more likely to stick with MySpace for a longer period of time. A researcher named Dana Boyd documented what she called white flight from MySpace into Facebook in those early years. Why were low-income teens still using Facebook? One of the reasons was Instagram in the beginning, less so now, was known more as a platform where, you know, rich kids show off their vacations or their nice stuff. Also, Snapchat, you know, it used a lot of data, which low-income teens weren't likely to have. So Facebook was still important for them as a technology that, you know, would help them fill in certain gaps when other resources were not available, to connect with others, share information, etc. You know, keeping in touch with their networks, finding support, whatever that is. So this data has changed a little bit since this came out, but my larger point is just that we always have to be a little bit skeptical of some of our assumptions about who's using social networks and why they're using them. Our motivations may not obviously be the same as that of others, and that sounds like common sense, but I often hear these kinds of assumptions just being spread around over social media all the time. Twitter use also, for example, has kind of evened out among demographic groups more recently, but for many years, African Americans were using Twitter at twice the rate of white people. So another interesting statistic that I think a lot of people really didn't realize. There's also an assumption out there that people only use social media to basically beef with others or talk about frivolous things, or, you know, whatever it is, spreading misinformation. This is an interesting statistic. This is also from the Pew Research Center. They have a lot of great data, by the way, on social media use and demographics that can be very useful to take a look at, and they update it fairly regularly. 32% social media users use the site to encourage others to take action on issues. Also interesting, politicians have seen an increase of people engaging with them on social media sites. So, you know, there is evidence that people are genuinely sharing things that they care about, things that are important to them, trying to interact for purposes of dialogue and democracy, which is what, you know, journalists like to say that we're all about. Even the digital divide, which is still, yes, a very important thing, that lower income people don't have access to broadband or high-end technology. Even that, there's some assumptions around that that can be incorrect. You know, phones are, and even to some extent smartphones, are extremely prevalent even among low-income communities because in today's world, it's absolutely vital for getting a job and doing just about anything else. So for most people, that's what they put a high priority on, even if they have relatively, little disposable income with which to spend. Now, data, in terms of what kind of plan that you may have, that may be in much shorter supply. So those are the kinds of things journalists need to think about. Text messages, this outlier media, and others are experimenting with can be a great way to get information to lower income communities and interact with them. But, things that require higher bandwidth may not be the greatest idea. But I often hear a lot of people just with a broad assumption that because of the digital divide, of course people don't have access to any form of technology, and that's not necessarily the case. My point here, I guess, overall, is just that, it's really easy to dismiss these tools entirely and be angry at them. But in some ways, being able to dismiss social media completely is in and of itself a privilege. Farhad Manjoo can quit Twitter because he already has a job, a really well-paying columnist job at the New York Times. An up-and-coming journalist doesn't have that level of privilege and may need to use, social media tools as a way to get noticed and get a job. The old ways that journalists use to find sources and network with potential employers, they weren't necessarily better when it came to diversity of ideas. In a lot of cases, they were worse. I was an intern at the Philadelphia Inquirer. I think that was in the year 2000 or so. And I remember going into the bathroom once and somebody had hung up signs in the bathroom asking if anybody knew people that met a certain characteristic. I can't remember what it was. Anyone that's huge fans of knitting or something like that, right? And it was a reporter looking for sources. That isn't better than posting something on Twitter, right? I mean, essentially what that is, of course, you're turning to your peers in the newsroom who are probably relatively more like you than, the average person on the street, especially, almost 20 years ago now, or I guess that is exactly 20 years ago now. That's not better. That doesn't mean that social media solves all your problems and all you have to do is just tweet it out and suddenly a diverse and fascinating array of sources is going to fall out from the sky. But, acting like the past was some type of holy time in which, we were able to connect with different types of people more meaningfully is just false. So we need to at least understand that. So again, social media still has value and importance, I would argue, even though you do have to be increasingly very conscious of its potential risks to both you and other people, including people in your community, your sources, etc. So again, this can be both bad and good and have pros and cons. So it's something that we need to talk about and may be dependent on very specific situations. So why for social journalism students, or really any journalist, is social media important to use? What are some of the pros? I've already listed a lot of the cons as well. For one thing, it is often a listening or a crowdsourcing tool that can scale. Face-to-face is outstanding, but it's not enough, even when there's no pandemic and, we can do more face-to-face work. A lot of award-winning stories, like ProPublica's investigative series about the long-term effects of Agent Orange on veterans, that one of your professors, Terry Paris Jr., was involved in producing. That relied heavily on Facebook groups as one tool that they used for crowdsourcing. Social media can be a reporting tool to help you find sources or figure out what's going on for breaking news, as well as other, types of stories. And we'll learn about a lot of different technologies out there that will help you monitor social media at scale. It is an audience growth tool. That is a little bit less of what Social J is all about, but at the same time, obviously, it's not a bad thing to want more people to be reading your work, or at least be able to find your work and know that it's out there. You know, Facebook used to be a very fundamental driver of traffic to news organizations. Even when I first started working here and we developed this program, since Facebook changed their algorithm and is now privileging friends and family much more often, it's not as important as it used to be, but social media is usually part of an audience growth strategy. You know, SEO has become increasingly important. Search engine optimization, if you're not familiar with that. You know, social media can also be a community building tool. Think about people who might have a really hard time finding each other otherwise, right? Imagine teenagers that live in rural areas that are extremely conservative and may have a really hard time finding anybody else in the LGBTQ community. You know, online communities, since even well before Facebook was even invented, you know, even in the really old days of forums and things like that, it was really important. I read a really interesting study that looked at community building among people with very extreme tattoos, drag queens in Brooklyn, and it talked a lot about how, you know, those tools can really help people find each other and build a sense of solidarity and support that would be difficult or impossible to do in real life situations. For some communities, social media doesn't make any sense, and their interactions are through a lot of other different types of technologies or face-to-face. That's certainly true. But it's useful to think about whether or not the community you might be serving is benefiting or could benefit from meeting in some way online. And yeah, I know talking about personal branding is a little bit gross, but you know, potential employers are going to Google you. They are. And like I said earlier in orientation, journalism is a small community, and it does really benefit you to have at least some presence on all of these platforms. This can be really critical to getting a job and establishing networks. You know, everyone will tell you that it's not a perfect world that we live in. Who you know does matter, and social media is one tool that you can use to get to know more people and help them to remember you for longer. I'm going to send this to you all in an email. It's an excellent online harassment field manual with a lot of advice and tools on protecting yourself on social. I highly recommend that you read it over carefully. For some people, using a pseudonym on some platforms may be something that you decide you want to do. I don't necessarily recommend that unless you're in a particularly high-risk group, but it's something you need to decide for yourselves. I do recommend that even if you have private accounts for yourself, which is perfectly fine, knock yourself out, do that, but that you also have some public-facing accounts, especially on Twitter, where people can find you. Because again, employers will Google you, and this is one way that you can impress them by the types of things that you're posting and by the fact that, you know, you're active there. You know, obviously, if your community is also a very vulnerable group, you know, that's another thing to take into consideration. Everybody is going to be a little bit different with this. So that's really, really important, is to understand, you know, some of the risks that are out there, the things you can do to protect yourself, and make very informed decisions for yourself how you are going to use these tools. So normally right now I would pause for discussion, but we're going to have that later on. So I'll just keep rolling and give you a few of my advice for being good on social media as a social journalist, from the perspective of getting a job and also entering the community online of engaged journalists. And we're out there. You know, there really is an online community of people that are interested in the same kind of work that you do. So my advice, and you know, you can take this with a grain of salt, you can listen to me or not, and like I said, Luis knows more than I do, so always defer to him. But here's how I would suggest thinking about social media. The first one is, you know, this is the same with everything else in social journalism. Listening is important. Be very deliberate in who you follow on Twitter and Instagram. When journalists say all I see is garbage in my feeds, I'm like, who the hell are you following? You know, it is okay to unfollow people that you find to be useless or mute them, you know, whatever the case may be. You know, search out diversity, both in general and in terms of the specific community or topic areas that you are interested in. You know, look for Twitter subcultures that may help you to know what kinds of issues mainstream media aren't covering very well. This is from a study of Black Twitter, which is one of those subcultures, by my friend Meredith Clark. You can check out the whole thing if you would like. It has a lot of very interesting data on it. But yeah, you know, 75% of Black Americans don't think that the media accurately report on their communities. So, you know, obviously listening to people face to face is important, but social media is another one of those tools that you can use to potentially, you know, remedy some of these historical inequities. The second thing that I really recommend in terms of how you use social media as a social journalism student is generosity. And Andy Carvin, he was actually at NPR when those uprisings were going on in the Middle East. He wrote a great book about his experiences, essentially covering you know, those uprisings from his house in Washington, D.C. by interacting with activists primarily on social media. And I loved when he said this because it just kind of validated something I'd been thinking and saying for a long time, but I was starting to think that I was crazy because for a lot of people, social media is essentially talked about like it's all about narcissism, right? You know, I mean, hey, look at me, here's my 18th selfie just from today. You know, not that there's anything inherently wrong with selfies, but, you know, that's the common perception that this is primarily what social media is all about. And what I see is that if you're doing this right with a spirit of generosity, it really is kind of a reverse narcissism in a way, right? Because you're trying to use social media in a way to share stuff that you believe is genuinely valuable to other people that might make their lives better or more interesting. And that obviously includes sharing other people's work, right, when it's relevant. I think one of the worst things you can do as a journalist, or if you have a new book out, is to basically only share links to your own stuff. That actually is, you know, a form of narcissism. But instead, you're sharing something that you've read that was really good or interesting. You're sharing something you observed that's beautiful or unique. You know, you're a journalist. You're out there every day talking to interesting people. Not all of what you talk about makes it into your story. You can share something that someone told you on Twitter or some other format, an interesting insight that they had, something funny. You know, having a sense of humor is not the worst thing. You know, the irony, I think, in all of this is that if you have this sharing ethic, the personal branding and the self-promotion just happen naturally and not in an annoying way. In other words, it's a byproduct rather than an end game. I think it's really annoying to go out there and essentially say, you know, I'm trying to use Twitter as a self-promotional tool because I know I'm going to graduate next year and I want to be ready. You know, I think if that's kind of the intentionality that you have, it's going to kind of show, and it gives sort of a false note, I guess, less authenticity. But I think if you're really genuine and thinking about these are things that I could share with others that might be useful to them, then you become someone that people rely on, and you just have a reputation for all of that. Just this is something that, at least for me, I think that's the type of nerd that that I've always been. Like I was the type of person before we had Facebook, like I would be annoyingly emailing you constantly, telling you absolutely have to read this article because it's amazing. I think even back in the day when we barely had the internet, I would be the one cutting the article out of the magazine and sending it to you, right? I've just always had kind of that instinct that if I saw something, I just really wanted to share it with everybody. But I think it's kind of the same concept as, you don't really show up to a party empty-handed. You can't expect people to just want to engage with you because you're a journalist. They don't really care that much. A lot of journalists just tweet something out and they really expect people to just, answer their question or eagerly volunteer themselves as sources. But that often doesn't work out that well if you haven't already sort of built up your reputation as a generous person. You're giving information as well as asking for it on any social media site. Sort of setting up that, ethic of having some reciprocity there. Some journalists prefer to just lurk. That can be okay, but it's a little bit creepy to just feel like somebody is just watching you, but is not sharing anything of themselves or their own knowledge. Here's an example of just using social media as, a networking tool as journalists. Ironically, Meredith Clark on the left is the author of the Black Twitter study that I mentioned earlier. This is us and Shannon at the hotel bar at a conference. But social media can be a way to sort of extend your relationships with people that you meet briefly because they're guest speakers in your class, or you're at a conference or a panel discussion and you meet them and you exchange business cards. But it was a pretty fleeting opportunity to meet them, so you really, didn't get the chance to forge that kind of lifelong connection. But if you use social media well, you can stay in touch with them. I'm not saying you necessarily become BFF and talk all the time, but the next time they have a job opening at their organization, they might be more likely to think of you than if you hadn't kind of continued on that sort of relationship. So, here are some ways to start using social media with an ethic of sharing. And I think some of you maybe are already doing this, and that's fine. But if that's not something you've historically been very comfortable with, here's some things you can think about. Sharing links to something that you've read is super easy and takes like 2 seconds to do, right? Things that you're reading as part of your classes, some of them you may find boring, but some of them you may be like, wow, yeah, that actually really had some key insights in it. Maybe I'll share it with other people that are interested in engaged journalism. Or something from The Onion, or, a news article that you thought was particularly important, sharing those types of things. Just being really observant. Always being alert to potential news, or, if you're a journalist and you see that a road is closed because of a recent accident, your instinct should be to maybe consider sharing that. Maybe not always in every case, but, being alert for things that you've observed that might be really useful to others. Interacting with others as appropriate, not just constantly pushing things out, but also being willing to answer questions or interacting with others. And also thinking visually. Social media is a very visual medium, of course, and, being observant, taking photographs of things that you see that are interesting, newsworthy, beautiful, etc. is something that you can think about. One journalist that has always done this very well since early in his career. You know, Brian Stelter at CNN is kind of a big shot now. He has his own show. But I remember when he was a very recent college graduate from Maryland, he was constantly interacting on Twitter, sharing all kinds of different things, not just what he'd written. He got a job at the New York Times right out of undergrad, which almost never happens. And of course, now I think it's a little bit harder for him to do that because he has a much larger following, but he's still a pretty interactive personality on social media. And I think that's been one reason, among others, of course, why, you know, he's had a very successful career. Why Twitter specifically? I mean, you should use whichever ones are your favorites. They're all good for very specific things. Different communities use different social networks. That's fine. I do suggest personally, my personal advice is that you do become an active Twitter user as a journalist. Why? Right? I mean, some people love it. Some of you may be like, oh my gosh, I absolutely hate Twitter. It's the worst. Well, here's the thing. Your tribe, your journalistic tribe, people in the same profession as you, they're on there. Maybe less so than they used to be, but it probably is still the best social networking site for journalists. It's not LinkedIn. You should absolutely have a profile on LinkedIn. That's really important. But just in terms of the networking factor, I still think Twitter is the most important one. You know, I'm pretty sure that I got the job as director of this program, at least partly, maybe mostly because of Twitter. You know, I had met Jeff Jarvis at a conference. You know, we got along great, but he probably would have forgotten about me, you know, some professor at the University of Memphis, very far away from New York City. But we kept in touch via Twitter, and when he decided with the dean that they were going to launch a new program, I was someone that he thought of to bring on. I've also met tons of other folks that have been very meaningful or helpful to me in my career that I now even consider friends through Twitter. I've also had students get jobs, at least in part, because of their Twitter connections. You know, sometimes you never know when an influencer might take notice of something that you wrote. A lot of social journalism students in the past have written Medium posts for class that ended up getting a lot of pickup on Twitter and ended up in very influential media newsletters. I remember way back when I was in Memphis, David Carr, the late David Carr, New York Times media columnist, he retweeted one of my students' projects. It was just so incredibly cool. You know, I think that there's a lot of journalists out there that are very willing to amplify and check out student work if they find it and it's accessible to them. So it basically, you know, it can even be fun sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes it can actually be fun. And it is also a good way to stay up on, you know, not only what's happening in the news, of course, but what's happening in our field. You know, it has certainly informed my research and teaching in a lot of ways, and, you know, can be particularly valuable. So, you know, you do you to some extent, but I have always noticed that students that really do up their social media use, both in terms of scrolling their feed from time to time and, you know, posting from time to time, have generally seen a lot of success with that. Just in terms of the kinds of connections they've made or jobs that they were able to get or freelance gigs that they landed and things like that. Just a couple of things about getting started with using Twitter well. You know, again, it's partly a listening tool. You know, in some cases for your communities, but I'm talking here more in terms of your work as a journalist. Finding key influencers that care about similar things than you do. Other people working in the field of engaged journalism. You can see who they follow or who they retweet and use that to build your list. It really does matter kind of how you build out your feed. If there's an event or a conference that is just really amazing, following those hashtags can be a great way to find people to follow and to interact. If we have a speaker in class that you really like, it can be a great idea to follow them, thank them, just kind of as a way to carry on the connection that you initially made. And creating lists. Twitter makes it possible to curate lists around particular topics. Jeff has a great, for example, coronavirus list that has a lot of epidemiologists and other experts on it. I have a Packer football list that I use during the games to see what people are talking about. So you can create, specific lists around your interests or areas that are professionally important to you, and that can be really valuable. As you yourself are tweeting, I think it's really important to always be sure that you're giving enough context for people to understand what you're talking about, being a little bit careful with acronyms. Of course, if you're primarily trying to reach a niche audience anyway, that's not something you have to worry about as much. But if you want your tweets to be more broadly accessible, then be sure that people know, where you are. What that term maybe means. And that can be challenging because you don't have a lot of characters, but I think that it does make you more likely to have people want to follow you. Time management is something to think about. I'm not suggesting, please don't get me wrong, that I am suggesting in some way that you just sit there and hang out on Twitter all day. That would be a terrible idea. And it can send you down a lot of different rabbit holes. Instead of that, think about just I am going to read my feed for 10 minutes max. That's it. Dipping in and out very briefly. Or if you find something to share, you can just pop on there and share it. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to start scrolling if you're busy and are working on other things. Come up with some workflows or strategies that are good for you. It does not have to be some massive rabbit hole type of thing. Some other quick tips about networking on Twitter for journalists. Having some personality is fine, I think. When I talk about social media to professors that primarily teach undergrads, they are so freaked out, right? Oh my gosh, if you encourage them to use social media, it's going to be all nudes and bongs. And, I'm like, calm down. Obviously, yes, we all have to use common sense. But what I have found over the years is that most, especially younger people, have been warned so many times by adults in their life about all of the horrible things that social media can do to their careers that they're more scared than anything else. And they end up with such a boring public-facing platform that literally nobody is going to care about anything that you're posting because it's so dry. You're never sharing even the slightest, benign personal detail about yourself, like I have a cat or whatever that case may be. I think it's okay if you're comfortable with it yourself personally. It's okay to lighten up a little bit. People connect with other human beings. They don't necessarily connect just with bots. I think that almost the worst thing that you could do is just project yourself as being a really bored or whiny person. That would be more likely to turn me off as a potential employer than, just showing that you have a sense of humor. Being friendly, being nice to others. I'm not talking about sucking up, but, everybody likes to feel like the talk they gave was good or the article they wrote was impactful. So, being nice and showing gratitude for things that were helpful to you is not the worst thing you can do in the world. And I sort of left the big elephant in the room till last, partly because we should probably talk about this more in a discussion format rather than me just telling you. But the obvious big question that everyone is going to ask is, how many political opinions should I be sharing publicly on social media, right? And you all read View from Somewhere before orientation. If you didn't read it, you absolutely should, because it's an incredible book. We'll be talking more about objectivity all semester long, which is also partly why I didn't want to get too into it now. But use social media for politics with caution, certainly, but there is no one-size-fits-all rule there. I fundamentally believe that. If you want to work for a mainstream publication someday, and especially if you think you want to cover politics for a mainstream news organization like, you know, the New York Times and Washington Post, you're probably going to want to be more conservative. Because whether I like it or whether you like it, there's still a lot of journalists that, you know, for some very good reasons, do not want to show any type of favoritism toward any political party or candidate online. And, you know, and I said, for some good reasons, even if you fundamentally believe objectivity, at least as it's commonly practiced in journalism, is bullshit, at the same time, you know, you are going to open yourself up to a lot of accusations of bias. You know, it's a complicated situation is all I'm saying. So you may want to use caution with that. That said, you know, people have different career goals. And I think that transparency is generally preferable to, you know, pretending that you don't have any opinions. But this is extremely complicated, right? You know, I do share my political opinions online, but I'm not a practicing journalist. If anything, I tend to think of journalism professors more like op-ed writers. You know, I try to be sure that I am reporting out or sharing the basis behind opinions that I have, but I'm not necessarily bound in any way to, you know, be nonpartisan. But I think that can be very different if you are a working journalist in a mainstream news organization. Many have very strict policies about what you can share and what you can't. So the most important thing is just to take that seriously, give it some thought. But there really aren't hard and fast rules on that, and there shouldn't be. You know, for a lot of us and for a lot of you, political policies, particularly right now, they might have a very serious personal impact on you and your families. And, you know, I don't think removing yourself completely as though those things don't matter is doing anyone a service on social media or anything else. But, you know, that doesn't mean that there aren't journalists that see professional norms in a different way than you do. And you're going to get sick of talking about the nuances around this, right? It's not a black and white thing. So we have to discuss it a lot. You're probably going to get tired of it overall. So every year I give this assignment, or maybe a challenge, if you will, to the students. And, you know, don't get yourself super freaked out about this, but it's called Photo a Day. And basically, the challenge is to post a photo every day on Instagram using the hashtag SocialJ21 of anything you want. Okay? You can, it doesn't have to be anything personal or personally revealing, or it could be more of kind of a personal diary of your first semester in the social journalism program during the pandemic, right? You could choose a theme for yourself or not. It could be completely random, whatever strikes your fancy. There are a lot of examples of folks doing photo a day challenges going back many, many years now. I heard about it 10 years ago, and I've actually been doing it ever since, although I officially post mine still on Flickr, although I use Instagram as well, and I'll do this along with you, so it's not just you. And then I'll ask you to just write a little reflection at the end of the semester as to how it went and what you learned or observed. Now, I'm not, y'all, like, chill. I'm not going to be checking every single day. If you find that you really, really hate doing this, like, it's fun, right? This is just more of a challenge as a way to, kind of practice building community on a social media site. It gives you some practice as well, just with, taking photographs and being observant, especially in, as I said before, a very visual social media world. And also, it's just kind of fun. It's a way for us, to kind of connect with each other and maybe get to know each other a little bit better through our daily photographs. You do not, this is really important, you do not have to use your current main account, okay? You can, that's fine. But I am not trying to take over your life and force you to post a bunch of photos you don't want your friends and family to see. You could make a separate account. Instagram allows you to do this. It's relatively easy to kind of toggle back and forth between two different accounts. If you want to create something that is just your photo a day account, no problem. Right? I am not in any way trying to dictate your personal social media use. This is more of just a class exercise. Try to practice with community building by, interacting with your classmates. And even beyond Instagram and even beyond the photo a day assignment, just more generally on social media, trying to think of things you might be able to share from your classes, assuming they aren't specifically off the record. Sometimes we have guests that share privileged information with us. Obviously, you don't want to share that, but other things, they don't mind if they're public. We have a Facebook group that I will send you all a link to that all of our alumni are on. I understand if you're not a big fan of Facebook, it's fine, but it's one place where we share engagement jobs. It can be one way that you can meet our alumni. Many of them are on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn and all of that as well. I really love it when I see students sharing, this is probably more of a Twitter thing, articles that are related to engagement, or things related to, your community and what you're learning as you begin down the path of listening to and engaging that community. I love seeing links to your own work. Again, if it's not the only thing that you're sharing, that's not narcissistic, but you absolutely should share things that you're doing. So what I'm trying to say is, I'd love to see us using kind of all the social networks, although it's not explicitly required to do that. You can think about all the things that I said earlier about your personal comfort levels. But, for Instagram, just try to get in. It also helps, I think, to learn a little bit of discipline. A lot of journalists, we have to be producing a lot of content on a very regular basis. And this is a very low stakes way to get some practice doing that. Again, this could be a picture of your dog every single day. Or maybe you want to put much more thought into really crafting an interesting photo every day. Even though you're probably not leaving your house as often during the pandemic, this is probably a much harder assignment, to be honest, than it is during normal years. I'm assuming at least sometimes you're getting out to get food or exercise or whatever. New York City is full of interesting things to take photographs of. It really is up to you. How you decide to do this and how much effort you want to put into it. But I just encourage you to kind of challenge yourself at least a little bit. A lot of people have started this assignment saying this seems stupid. I don't want to do this. you know, I see Instagram only for like really highly curated moments when I look great and my house looks great and I just want to brag and everything else like that. But, you know, but then later on, after a few weeks, I've had many students say to me, you know, this was really interesting. I kind of learned some things about myself and I thought about, you know, these tools in kind of a different way, just from experimenting with kind of a different approach. So again, that can also be on a completely separate account so that you're not spamming your friends and family if you want. Or, you know, knock yourself out. They might be really interested to see, you know, here's your pandemic life. So this will start on the first day of class. The reflection will be due on the end of the semester. Again, don't freak out about this, but just, you know, give it a try. And also, you know, give using Twitter a little bit more frequently a try as well, even though there's no kind of specific assignment around that. Both Jeff Jarvis and I tweet very regularly, all kinds of things that at least hopefully are relevant to you. You know, I'm not looking for more followers, but I do think that, you know, some of the things that we share might be particularly valuable to you. You know, but we're not the only ones out there. There's a lot of other folks in this community, and there's certainly a lot of alumni that are out there sharing things as well. So that's all, and I hope I can hear more of your thoughts on all of this, and, you know, that we can discuss this a little bit more soon.